The brass key first appeared on the doorstep of the Pembroke mansion at 42 Calhoun Street on a sweltering August morning in 1846, when plantation overseer Jeremiah Blackwater discovered it gleaming against the weathered cypress planks like a drop of molten gold that had somehow cooled into an impossible shape. The key was unlike anything Blackwater had ever seen. Its head was carved with symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles, and its shaft was longer than any door key had reason to be, as if it were designed to unlock something far more substantial than a simple household entrance. What made the discovery particularly unsettling was not just the key's strange appearance, but the fact that it had materialized overnight on property that was surrounded by high walls and guarded by dogs that had been trained to alert at the first sign of intruders. The Pembroke estate was one of Charleston's most secure residences, home to cotton merchant Augustus Pembroke and his family, who had good reason to be cautious about unexpected visitors in a city where tensions between social classes ran as deep as the harbor waters. Blackwater had been making his usual dawn inspection of the grounds when he spotted the brass key lying perfectly centered on the front doorstep, positioned with geometric precision that suggested it had been placed there by someone with an obsessive attention to detail. The morning dew had settled around it but not upon it, creating a dry outline that made the key appear to be floating slightly above the wooden surface. Have you ever found a mysterious object that seemed to appear from nowhere, or discovered that something in your home had moved to a different location overnight without any explanation? Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Blackwater's first instinct was to leave the key where he'd found it and inform Mr. Pembroke of the strange discovery, but something about the brass object compelled him to pick it up and examine it more closely. The moment his fingers made contact with the metal, he felt a peculiar warmth that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat, and for just an instant, he could have sworn he heard the distant sound of a door opening somewhere deep within the mansion behind him. The overseer turned to look back at the house, but all the windows remained dark and shuttered against the morning heat, and no sound of movement came from within the building where the Pembroke family still slept. Yet the sensation persisted that something had changed in the moment he'd touched the brass key, as if his contact with the mysterious object had activated some mechanism that would continue operating, whether he understood its purpose or not. Augustus Pembroke was a practical man who had built his fortune through careful attention to detail and a healthy skepticism toward anything that couldn't be explained through logic and commerce. When Blackwater brought him the brass key along with an account of its mysterious appearance, Pembroke's initial reaction was to assume that one of his business associates had dropped the item during a recent visit and that it had somehow been overlooked until the morning's inspection. But Pembroke's pragmatic explanation became harder to maintain when he examined the key himself and realized that it bore no resemblance to any lock or mechanism in his house or anywhere else in Charleston. The symbols carved into its head were unlike any decorative motifs he'd encountered in his travels throughout the South, and the key's unusual length and weight suggested it had been crafted for some specific purpose that went far beyond ordinary household security. More disturbing still was Pembroke's discovery that the brass key seemed to be warm to the touch, regardless of the ambient temperature, maintaining a consistent heat that felt almost body-like, but couldn't be explained by exposure to sunlight or proximity to any heat source. When he held the key for more than a few moments, Pembroke began to experience vivid mental images of rooms and corridors that didn't exist in his mansion, but felt familiar in a way that suggested he'd walked through them before, though he had no memory of when or where such experiences might have occurred. The first supernatural manifestation associated with the brass key occurred 3 days after its discovery, when Pembroke's wife Carolyn reported hearing the sound of a door opening and closing repeatedly during the early morning hours. The sounds seemed to originate from different parts of the house each night, sometimes from the upper floors where the family's bedrooms were located, sometimes from the ground floor where the formal parlors and dining rooms were arranged, and occasionally from the basement levels where the household stores and servants' quarters were situated. Caroline Pembroke was a woman of refined sensibilities who prided herself on maintaining perfect order within her household, and the mysterious sounds disrupted both her sleep and her sense of domestic control. She conducted thorough investigations of every room and corridor where the sounds seemed to originate, but never found any evidence that doors had actually been opened or closed, nor could she identify any mechanism that might produce the realistic audio phenomena she was experiencing. The sounds were accompanied by subtle changes in the household atmosphere that Caroline found increasingly difficult to ignore or rationalize. Rooms that had been comfortably furnished and decorated began to feel somehow hollow, as if their familiar contents were present, but not quite real. Mirrors throughout the house seemed to reflect scenes that were almost but not entirely accurate, showing furniture arranged in slightly different configurations or displaying shadows that didn't correspond to the objects that should have cast them. Most unsettling of all were the doors themselves, which Caroline began to notice were behaving in ways that defied her understanding of how properly hung and maintained household portals should function. Doors that she clearly remembered closing would be found standing open hours later, while others that she was certain had been left open would be discovered firmly shut, and somehow more difficult to open than they had been before. The Pembroke family's teenage daughter Victoria was the first to report seeing actual figures associated with the mysterious door sounds, describing glimpses of people moving through the house during the night hours who appeared to be dressed in clothing from earlier time periods. These phantom visitors didn't seem to be aware of the current residence or household arrangements, moving through rooms as if the spaces were configured differently than they actually were, and attempting to use doors and passages that no longer existed or had never been part of the mansion's original architecture. Victoria's encounters with these temporal intruders began as brief sightings in her peripheral vision, shadowy forms that disappeared when she turned to look at them directly. But as the supernatural activity intensified, the phantoms became more solid and detailed, allowing her to observe their clothing, facial features, and behavior patterns with increasing clarity and growing alarm. The figures appeared to be from various historical periods, some dressed in the formal attire of Charleston's colonial era, while others wore the simpler clothing of more recent decades. What united them was their apparent familiarity with the Pembroke mansion and their obvious confusion about its current state and occupancy. They moved through the house as if following established routines, attempting to access rooms that had been reconfigured or entering spaces that they clearly expected to find arranged differently. Most disturbing of all was their interaction with the house's doors, which seemed to respond to the phantom visitors in ways that defied the physical laws governing how such mechanisms should operate. Doors would open and close for the temporal intruders without any visible contact, while passages that appeared solid and impassable to living inhabitants would allow the phantoms to move through them as if they were empty space. The connection between these supernatural manifestations and the brass key became apparent when Augustus Pembroke discovered that the mysterious object would grow noticeably warmer whenever the phantom visitors were active in the house. The key seemed to serve as a sort of supernatural thermometer, its temperature fluctuations providing advance warning of when the temporal intrusions were about to begin and indicating their intensity and duration. Pembroke began carrying the brass key with him throughout the house during the evening hours, using its temperature changes to predict and track the movement of the phantom visitors. This monitoring revealed that the supernatural activity followed consistent patterns, with different types of temporal intruders appearing at specific times and in particular locations throughout the mansion. The colonial-era figures tended to manifest in the formal parlors and dining rooms during the early evening hours, moving through these spaces as if preparing for or conducting social gatherings that existed only in their own temporal frame of reference. The more recent phantoms appeared later in the night, primarily in the family's private quarters and service areas, going about domestic routines that suggested they had once lived in the house during periods when it had been arranged and furnished differently. But the most unsettling discovery was Pembroke's realization that the phantom visitors seemed to be aware of the brass key and its significance, their behavior changing noticeably whenever he carried it into rooms where they were manifesting. Some of the temporal intruders would approach him with expressions of recognition, as if the key marked him as someone they expected to encounter, while others would flee from its presence as if it represented a threat to their ability to maintain their foothold in the physical world. The supernatural activity reached a new level of intensity when Pembroke's young son Marcus reported that one of the phantom visitors had spoken to him, delivering a message that revealed the true purpose of the brass key and the reason for its mysterious appearance at the Pembroke mansion. The phantom, dressed in the clothing of Charleston's early colonial period, had appeared in Marcus's bedroom during the pre-dawn hours and identified himself as Cornelius Pembroke, Augustus's great-grandfather who had died decades before Marcus was born. According to the phantom's message, the brass key was a family heirloom that had been lost during Cornelius's lifetime and had been searching for its way back to the Pembroke bloodline ever since. The key had been crafted by a locksmith who possessed knowledge of supernatural metalworking techniques, designed to serve as a master key that could unlock not just physical doors but barriers between different periods of time and states of existence. The phantom of Cornelius Pembroke explained that the key had been created to allow the Pembroke family to maintain contact with their deceased ancestors and to access knowledge and resources that had been accumulated over generations of successful business and social activities. But the key's power had proven too dangerous for regular use, and Cornelius had hidden it away shortly before his death to prevent it from falling into the hands of family members who might not understand the responsibilities that came with its possession. The temporal disruptions currently affecting the mansion were the result of the key's attempts to re-establish its connection with the Pembroke family, drawing together different periods of the house's history and allowing figures from various eras to interact with the current residents. The phantom visitors were not intruders but family members and household inhabitants from different time periods, all of whom had been connected to the brass key during their lifetimes, and were now being pulled back into partial existence by its supernatural emanations. But Cornelius's phantom warned that the key's power was unstable without proper guidance and control, and that continued exposure to its influence would eventually blur the boundaries between past and present so thoroughly that the current Pembroke family might find themselves displaced into other time periods, while phantoms from earlier eras took up permanent residence in the mansion. The warning proved prophetic when Augustus Pembroke began experiencing episodes during which he would find himself in versions of his house that corresponded to earlier periods in its history. During these temporal displacements, he would encounter family members and servants who had lived and worked in the mansion decades earlier, all of whom treated him as if he belonged in their time period and expected him to participate in activities and routines that had no relevance to his actual life and circumstances. These episodes initially lasted only a few minutes, but they gradually extended in duration and became more frequent, suggesting that the brass key was drawing Augustus deeper into the temporal network it had created. During his displacements, he would experience complete sensory immersion in earlier periods, smelling cooking odors from meals that had been prepared years before his birth, and hearing conversations between people who had been dead for decades. Most unsettling of all was Augustus's growing realization that his experiences during these temporal episodes felt more real and substantial than his normal existence in 1846. The earlier versions of the mansion seemed more solid and permanent than the current reality, and the people he encountered during his displacements possessed a vitality and presence that made his contemporary family members seem pale and insubstantial by comparison. The crisis reached its peak when Caroline Pembroke discovered that her husband was beginning to fade from the current time period, even when he wasn't experiencing obvious temporal displacements. Augustus would become translucent for brief periods, his physical form taking on the same ghostly appearance that characterized the phantom visitors, and during these episodes he would speak and behave as if he were still living in earlier decades of the mansion's history. Caroline's attempts to anchor her husband in the present by removing the brass key from his possession proved ineffective, as the supernatural object had apparently established a permanent connection with him that couldn't be severed through simple physical separation. Even when the key was locked away in a strongbox, Augustus would continue to experience temporal displacements and gradual fading, as if the brass object's influence operated independently of proximity or direct contact. The situation became even more complex when Victoria and Marcus Pembroke began showing signs of temporal displacement as well, their experiences suggesting that the brass key's influence was spreading throughout the family bloodline rather than remaining confined to the person who had initially made contact with it. Both children reported encounters with phantom relatives and episodes during which their familiar surroundings would shift to correspond with earlier periods in the mansion's history. But unlike their father's gradual absorption into the temporal network, the children's displacements seemed to be strengthening their connection to the present rather than drawing them away from it. They began to demonstrate an intuitive understanding of the brass key's functions and limitations, developing the ability to control and direct their temporal experiences rather than being passive victims of supernatural forces beyond their comprehension. Victoria discovered that she could use her connection to the brass key to communicate with phantom visitors from different time periods, gathering information about the mansion's history and the previous owners who had been affected by the supernatural object. Through these communications, she learned that the brass key had been creating temporal disruptions for over a century, connecting different generations of residents and creating a complex network of overlapping time periods that existed simultaneously within the same physical space. Marcus developed the ability to perceive the temporal layers that the brass key had created throughout the mansion, seeing past and present versions of rooms and corridors superimposed upon each other like multiple exposures on a photographic plate. This enhanced perception allowed him to navigate the temporal displacements more effectively than the adult family members, who remained confused and disoriented by experiences that exceeded their rational understanding of how time and space should function. The children's growing mastery of the brass key's supernatural properties provided the Pembroke family with their first hope of resolving the temporal crisis that threatened to displace them permanently from their own time period. But their success came with the recognition that the supernatural forces affecting their house were far more complex and extensive than they had initially understood. The brass key wasn't simply a mystical object that had appeared at their door by accident or coincidence. It was part of a larger supernatural network that connected properties throughout Charleston, linking buildings and families that had been touched by similar temporal disruptions over the course of the city's long and tumultuous history. The Pembroke mansion was just one node in this network, and the temporal visitors they had been encountering were representatives of a much larger community of displaced souls who existed in the spaces between different historical periods. Through their communications with phantom visitors, the Pembroke children learned that Charleston itself had become a focal point for temporal displacement, its history of violence and tragedy creating conditions that allowed past and present to bleed together in ways that affected both the living and the dead. The brass key and similar supernatural objects were tools that had been created to help certain families navigate these temporal disturbances, but they also served to perpetuate and expand the network of displacement that connected different periods and locations throughout the city. The children's investigations revealed that the brass key could be used not just to access other time periods, but to influence and reshape the temporal network itself. With proper understanding and careful application, the key's power could be directed toward stabilizing the boundary between past and present, allowing displaced souls to complete their interrupted journeys while preventing living individuals from being absorbed into temporal vortices that would remove them from their proper place in history. But using the brass key in this manner required a level of supernatural knowledge and spiritual strength that exceeded anything the Pembroke family had previously encountered. The temporal forces affecting Charleston were not random disruptions, but the result of deliberate actions taken by individuals who had understood the city's unique susceptibility to chronological manipulation, and had created the supernatural network for purposes that remained hidden from contemporary understanding. The children's growing connection to the brass key brought them into contact with these historical figures, phantom entities who possessed knowledge of temporal manipulation techniques that had been developed and refined over generations of supernatural experimentation. These entities offered to teach the Pembroke family how to use the brass key's full potential, but their instruction came with warnings about the personal costs and social responsibilities that accompanied mastery of such dangerous supernatural abilities. The final revelation came when Victoria and Marcus Pembroke discovered that their family's connection to the brass key and Charleston's temporal network was not accidental but hereditary, the result of bloodline characteristics that had been carefully cultivated over multiple generations. The Pembroke family had been selected as guardians of the supernatural network, charged with maintaining the delicate balance between different time periods and ensuring that temporal disruptions didn't spread beyond Charleston's boundaries to affect other regions. This responsibility explained why the brass key had returned to the family after decades of absence, and why Augustus Pembroke had been so strongly affected by its influence. The supernatural object had been seeking its rightful guardians, and its appearance at the mansion marked the beginning of a new phase in the Pembroke family's supernatural duties. But accepting this role meant acknowledging that their lives would never again follow normal patterns of human existence. They would become permanent residents of the spaces between time periods, aging more slowly than ordinary people, while maintaining connections to past and future that would allow them to influence historical events and guide the development of Charleston's unique supernatural characteristics. The choice facing the Pembroke family was whether to embrace their hereditary role as temporal guardians or to attempt to break the supernatural connections that bound them to Charleston's chronological network. Each option carried significant risks and irreversible consequences that would affect not just their own family, but the broader community of displaced souls who depended on their stewardship of the temporal forces affecting the city. Augustus Pembroke, despite his initial displacement and confusion, ultimately chose to accept the responsibilities that came with possession of the brass key. His decision was influenced by his growing understanding that the temporal network served important purposes that went beyond the supernatural experiences affecting his own family. The displaced souls who moved through Charleston's temporal layers were not lost or damned, but participants in a larger system that preserved important aspects of the city's history and culture that would otherwise be forgotten or destroyed by the passage of ordinary time. Caroline Pembroke found the adjustment more difficult, struggling to accept that her carefully ordered household would never again conform to normal domestic routines. But she gradually developed an appreciation for the expanded perspective that came with connection to the temporal network. Gaining access to the accumulated wisdom and experience of previous generations of Pembroke women who had faced similar challenges and responsibilities. Victoria and Marcus adapted most readily to their new roles, their youth and natural supernatural sensitivity, allowing them to develop abilities that exceeded those of their parents and established them as the next generation of temporal guardians. They began to understand that their supernatural inheritance was not a burden, but an opportunity to participate in something far more significant than ordinary human existence. The brass key that had appeared so mysteriously on their doorstep became the symbol and instrument of their transformation, its supernatural properties allowing them to navigate the complex temporal landscape of Charleston while maintaining their connection to their own historical period. Through its power, they learned to see their city not as a single moment in time, but as a living tapestry woven from threads that stretched across centuries of human experience and supernatural influence. The Pembroke family's acceptance of their role as temporal guardians marked the beginning of a new era in Charleston's supernatural history, one in which the boundaries between past and present would be carefully maintained rather than allowed to blur into chaos. The brass key would continue to serve as their guide and tool, its mysterious symbols finally revealing their true meaning to those who possessed the wisdom and courage to accept the responsibilities of supernatural stewardship. Years later, visitors to Charleston would sometimes report strange experiences in the vicinity of Calhoun Street, encounters with figures who seemed to exist partially in different time periods and buildings that appeared to shift between historical configurations. But these manifestations were no longer chaotic disruptions, but carefully controlled glimpses of the city's temporal complexity, managed by guardians who understood the delicate balance required to preserve both past and present in their proper relationships to each other. The brass key remained in the possession of the Pembroke family, passed down through generations who continued to serve as stewards of Charleston's unique supernatural characteristics. Each generation would face its own challenges and opportunities, guided by the accumulated wisdom of their ancestors and the mysterious power contained within the seemingly simple piece of brass that had first appeared on their doorstep during that sweltering August morning in 1846. If this haunting tale of temporal displacement and supernatural guardianship sent chills through your soul, hit that like button and subscribe for more spine-tingling stories from Charleston's mysterious past. Have you or someone you know ever encountered objects that seemed to unlock more than they should, or experienced moments when past and present seemed to blend together in unexplainable ways? Share your experiences in the comments below. We're always fascinated by stories of keys and objects that connect us to history in supernatural ways.